Thus, what in religion was content or a form for presenting an other is here the self's own act. The notion requires the content to be the self's own act. For this notion is, as we see, the knowledge of the self's act within itself as all essentiality and all existence, the knowledge of this subject as substance, and of the substance as this knowledge of its act. Our own act here has been simply to gather together the separate moments, each of which in principle exhibits the life of spirit in its entirety, and also to stick to the notion in the form of the notion, the content of which would already have yielded itself in those moments and in the form of a shape of consciousness. Paragraph 797 is quite important. It is the first of 4 short paragraphs that are carrying out an incredibly important set of pivots or transitions from where we've been in the absolute knowing section, heading into some speculations or rather consolidations, ultimately about time and history and the nature of absolute knowing and the consciousness. There's so much that we could say here. I could go on and on and on. And 797 and 798 go together in part because they're both talking about, the transition point between them, this shape of consciousness, a gestalt, right? And this is a term that we've been using throughout the phenomenology. Maybe we'll pause on that and talk a little bit about what a shape of consciousness really is in the next paragraph commentary. I do want to point a few things out about the Miller translation. Usually I'm pretty easy on Miller, in part because I've been a translator myself, not so much from German, but more from French and Latin and from Greek. I've done some German translation as well in my time. And I know how difficult it can be to find exactly the right word or the best phrasing for something. And, I'll point out here and there, Miller's making a choice here, or he's adding something. This is a paragraph where, without tearing Miller down, I want to say, wow, there's a greater concentration of questionable choices on the translator's part in this little paragraph by comparison to many others. So, one that I'm going to bring up is this important, repetition of our own act, right? Because he's talking so much in the first couple sentences about the self's own act, the eigenes tun des Selbst. And we see him using this same phrase. So we would imagine that, we're elaborating it in the abstract, and then we talk about our own action, and there isn't any of that language actually in there. It's was wir hier hinzugetan, right? So what we here in this place, at this time, in this transition, did, in this or back then. And so it's not, it is our own act, true, right? But we should understand this more as a gloss on Miller's part than what Hegel himself is actually saying here. There's another thing where, in German, and Hegel actually just did this in the previous paragraphs, partly, tiles, right? And in the second part, when he says, our own act here has been simply to gather together the separate moments, it's actually tiles, die Versammlung, right? And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So it's not simply, because it's actually doing two different things. Partly gathering together, partly sticking to. So the phrasing there is a little bit misleading for a Germanless reader. We should also point out that in that section, Miller turns nouns that do signify processes into active verbs of what it is that we are doing, right? So die Versammlung, versammeln is to gather together, right? But this is the process of gathering together. And then sticking to, das Festhalten, right? Again, it is an active process that's going on, but it's not in the German, so clearly a verb as it is there. So there's a few things. Of course, we should point out for this paragraph and all the succeeding ones, we're using this term notion because Miller uses it as well, but more commonly we translate Begriff as concept. Notion, concept, that's okay. Either one is fine. So what is actually happening here in this paragraph? Let's start at the start. What in religion, here's one more thing, was content or a form for presenting an other? Okay, so form for presenting is form, and then the term presenting is actually Vorstellung, right? So that should be either, to be consistent with Miller, picture thinking, or it should just be representation, right? It shouldn't just be presenting an other. As a matter of fact, darstellen is used a little bit later in the second part of this. Darstellen, Vorstellen, not exactly the same. Vorstellen and Vorstellung is representation, right? Darstellung is more putting forward, presenting, or something like that. So what is religion doing? The previous section. What in religion was content, Inhalt, or a form for representation of an other? So, we talked about this in the previous paragraph. What is going on in religion is that we're not quite finished up with working through the concept, the notion, because we still have a bifurcation. The representation is of an other that we can grasp ourselves as somehow participating in, like through the community, the cultists, the narratives, all of that sort of stuff. But there's still this alterity there. So what in religion was that? Here is... Now, think about what we've been talking about in the previous paragraphs, the self's own act. Now, the word here for act is not the term that we've been using in the last several paragraphs, handeln, although tun has been used at a certain point. Here, eigenes Tun des Selbst, right? So the self is acting. And this goes back to the point that we made in the previous paragraph that, for Hegel, activity or action and actuality, right? So Handeln, Tun, and Wirklichkeit are incredibly important. We don't want to retreat into a mere idealism that just speculates the world. There is an ongoing activity here. And you can say, well, speculation, that is, looking upon or thinking about, that is active, right? But there's also this very important sense of being a subject within the world who acts. So the notion, he says, and this is very interesting, requires, verbindet es, right? It makes it happen to be the case. It requires, it imposes upon it, on the content that religion has been dealing with, to be the self's own act. What does that mean now? The self is taking charge of it. And here we get this long sentence, which there's a lot going on here that we need to unpack. For this notion is, as we see, we the phenomenologists looking on, right, the phenomenologists who are going to be moving into this shape of consciousness, is the knowledge of the self's act within itself as all essentiality and all existence, the knowledge of this subject as substance, and of the substance as the knowledge of this act. Now, as I was thinking about this, I decided that it might be helpful to actually reverse the order of some of this within the sentence. So this is all knowledge, Wissen, which is what this final section is about, absolute, Wissen. But the second two things. So we've got knowledge of what? Knowledge of this subject, the subject being the self, grasping the content, as substance. Now, he's not going to do much with that here. We are going to see that in the later paragraphs coming back. And this is, pretty familiar to you if you've gone through Hegel's Phenomenology. Self, subject, substance, these are all, the S terms that we use a lot. And then this substance, the knowledge is of this subject as substance. The knowledge is of this substance, meaning this subject, as this knowledge in its act. Act of what? Act of getting to know things, learning, understanding, engaging with. The substance, an active substance, a subjective substance, is grasping knowledge. Is it the final knowledge? It could be in its act, the own act, the eigenes tun. The proper act would be another way of thinking about this. And so then after we think about it in those terms and pause on that for a moment, we can say that this knowledge is also, as he's going to say right here, right, the knowledge of the self's own act within itself. Des Tuns des Selbst in sich. And notice that the German, is a little bit reversing this. The knowledge is of des, right? The sort of the genitive here in German, right? We would say the possessive in English. Of the act of the self in itself. And then the in sich there is sort of an intensifier, right? It's in a way saying the real action, the actual act, if we want to be a little bit facetious. But the in sich could apply both to the act, the tun, right? The act in itself, and to the self in itself. Reflexive, intensifying the self. Makes perfect sense from a Hegelian perspective. And then we go on, as what? Now notice the two sides of this. As all essentiality, alles, right? So it's not just as essentiality, but as all essentiality, and it's not as essence, it's, which would be Wesen, it's Wesenheit, right? The essentiality and all existence, Dasein. Now, does this mean that the self really becomes all existence? No. But the self is grasping itself at the center of existence, oriented towards something that is essentiality, right? So all of this is going on with this unpacking of what it is that the notion requires the content to be, namely the self's own act. Then we get this transition. What is our own act, or literally what it is that we did here in this? So it's leading us to a shape of consciousness, a Gestalt des Bewusstseins, right? And, we've got lots of shapes of consciousness along the way. That's cool. Maybe it's a shape of consciousness we've already encountered in the religion section, or perhaps, as Hegel's been stressing, in the spirit section, or maybe it's a new shape of consciousness. We'll have to see when we get to the next paragraph, right? But what is our own act doing? So this is where the tiles comes up, the partly. In part this, in part that. So it's gathering together. That's one thing that it's doing. What is it gathering together? The separate, or, we could also translate this as individual, einzelne, moments the separate moments. And what else does Hegel tell us about this gathering? Each of which, in principle, exhibits the life, Leben, of spirit in its entirety. Okay, so what are we talking about there? We're talking about moments that themselves are not just moments of a particular gestalt. We're talking about entire gestalten, right? Entire shapes of consciousness that we have gone through previously. And then it does something else alongside this, which is to stick to, das Festhalten, it clings to, right? The notion in the form of the notion as it is being developed, the notion as such, we could say, the truly conceptual concept. And what does he tell us about that? The content of which would already have yielded itself in those moments, in those separate moments. The content, but not yet completely the form, because that's going to lead us to the shape of consciousness, right? In the form of a shape of consciousness. So again, we have to ask ourselves, okay, good. Is it a shape we already know? Is it a shape we've run into before? Or is this something new that's being contributed? And that's where we get ready to move into the next paragraph. This last shape of spirit, the spirit which at the same time gives its complete and true content, the form of the self, and thereby realizes its notion as remaining in its notion, in this realization, this is absolute knowing. It is spirit that knows itself in the shape of spirit, or a comprehensive knowing in terms of the notion. Truth is not only in itself completely identical with certainty, but it also has the shape of self-certainty, or it is in its existence in the form of self-knowledge. Truth is the content which in religion is still not identical with its certainty. But this identity is now a fact in that the content has received the shape of the self. As a result, that which is the very essence, that is the notion, has become the element of existence, or has become the form of objectivity for consciousness. Spirit, manifesting or appearing in consciousness in this element, or what is the same thing, produced in it by consciousness, is science. We start paragraph 798 answering the question that was raised for us at the end of the previous paragraph, namely, what is this shape of spirit that we're looking at, a shape of consciousness? And it turns out it's the last shape of spirit, absolute knowing. So this final section is itself constituting a new gestalt of consciousness. And as we're going to see at the end of this paragraph, he's going to bring in another term which we saw discussed quite a bit in the preface, namely science, right? Wissenschaft. And there's an important transition going on here, what actually constitutes that. We're not going to get too deep into that, but we should think about what a gestalt is. And this is a very, very interesting paragraph in that shape, which we typically see being used for shape of consciousness, right? It's being used for shape of spirit, shape of the self, shape of self-certainty, right? It's being transformed, or rather, it's a term that's being extended into all sorts of possible applications. So he tells us this last shape of spirit is absolute knowing. Okay, so what is this last shape of spirit then? He tells us that the spirit gives its complete and true content. Now, complete there, brought to fruition, right? It's not just complete as in like ticking off a bunch of boxes. It's fully developed, and it's also true. And we're going to see truth talked about quite a bit here. And we should remember that in Hegel, truth and certainty, there's been this dialectic going back and between them. You begin with certainty, and then you start thinking about what you're certain of, and you find out that, oh, it's not completely true. So you try to get to the true, and in the process you lose some of the certainty, which is good because that's being scientific, being hedging your bets, qualifying, and then you want to bring the two of them together. It's, the typical Hegelian shuffle, right? So it gives complete or true content, Inhalt, we've just been talking a lot about content, the form of the self. What is the form of the self? Well, the self is something dynamic. The self is something that can bring negativity within its own confines and has to do so by virtue of being a self. A self, if we want to play off of a word that we're going to unpack here in just a little bit, a self is not a pure, timeless identity. It doesn't remain exactly the same all the time. He goes on in this, and he says that it thereby, by giving this complete and true content, the form of the self, realizes its notion, the Begriff, right, as remaining in its notion in this realization. Now, the German is a little bit closer to this, as it remains in this realization and thereby in this notion, right? So I think the translation implies that by remaining in the notion, it remains in the realization, when it's actually lexically the opposite. And I do want to point out here that Hegel doesn't use anything like, Wirklich or Wirklichkeit, which we often do translate as reality or, actuality or realization. He's actually using the Latinate term realisieren, right? And it's being used as a verb and then as a noun that's composed of that verb. And we could say produces just as much as makes real, right? Producing is making something real, making something that was merely possible or conceived of into something that we can actually see. So it's not totally disengaged from actuality or reality, right? So it produces, it realizes, it unpacks, it makes complete this notion as it remains, bleibt, as it stays in this realization. So there's something important about, if you want to have the notion or the concept, you got to, if we go back to the preface, you have to tarry with the negative. You have to linger with the things that we do encounter. You can't just retreat into idealistic la-la land and make it all up as you go along. You got to work with the stuff that you got. Now, he goes on in this, and he tells us that it is spirit that knows itself in, and again, we encounter Gestalt, in the shape of spirit, right? So the last shape of spirit in absolute knowing, spirit knows itself in the proper shape of spirit, which it's been working towards this entire time. And here we, again, it would be nice if we used concept rather than notion, because what he's talking about here is a knowing, a wissen, that is comprehensive or conceptual, begreifende. It wraps itself around the object of its knowledge. It knows itself in knowing the object of its knowledge. Again, that's part of what Wissenschaft or science in its full sense is going to mean. We've got to be careful, too, when we read the word science, not to imagine that in German it means exactly the same thing that we call science, which is a little bit more restrictive, right? We don't typically think of philosophy or history as sciences, but they are, in fact, sciences in this conception. And part of what makes something more scientific is that it is comprehensive, right? So spirit is knowing itself comprehensively, conceptually, not just by means of representation or the, as Hegel will call it later in the lectures on the philosophy of religion, the understanding way, but it's grasping it through reason. So we go on here. And now he starts talking about truth. And he says a lot of things about truth or Wahrheit here. Truth is not only in itself completely identical with certainty, right? And certainty here, Gewissheit. Now, completely identical with, bit of a mistranslation there. The completely is not a superlative. It's actually vollkommen, right? And this is the complete here, vollkommen. So brought to its fruition, fully developed, right? But identical. So identical here. Hegel is using a term that we have to be a little bit careful. He's using the term gleich, which is an adjective here, and then he's going to talk about Gleichheit, which gets translated as identity. Gleich can, in fact, mean equal to, but it doesn't necessarily imply being exactly the same thing. So, equality, equivalence, congruence, right? There's a lot of ways we could render this. So truth isn't identical as in being entirely substitutable for or being exactly the same thing as certainty, but it's finally been harmonized, you could say, with certainty, which is what we've been looking for this whole entire process of the phenomenology. So he goes on and he says it also has the shape, again, Gestalt, of self-certainty. Now, is this self-certainty as in Selbstgewissheit? No, it's Gewissheit seiner selbst. This might seem to be quibbling a little bit, right? But it might be translated better as certainty of its very own self. And you can say, well, how's that different than self-certainty? Well, there's a more intensive, reflexive thing being signaled here by the very language. Certainty of its very own self. Truth is this, which means truth. So let's have a little bit of a digression, right? Sometimes we talk in intro to philosophy classes about different theories of truth, and we say, Hegel is not a big fan of the correspondence theory of truth, which is partly true. And he's not, a pragmatist. He's very much about a different kind of truth, which has to do with the totality and everything holding together, which we call often the coherence theory of truth. Hegel doesn't use that language. This is coming much later on, right? Now, what this implies, though, here is that truth is not just something which the subject sits back and then notes in the entire whole. This is very important for what absolute knowing is. And this goes back to the comprehensive, begreifende knowing, right? It is not just you as the subject grasping the totality and seeing that there's no real incoherencies or contradictions left between the different elements, or however we want to frame it, the moments, the propositions. You are in there as truth, right? So this is not just a coherence theory of truth where the truth grasper sits back and just gets the totality. You are part of that totality. So what's going on here is different. It's a richer concept, if we want to use that term. I think it would be perfectly appropriate, of truth that is at play here, where the truth itself is consciousness, right? Anyway, it is the shape of self-certainty. And then he goes on and says something else that is quite interesting, right? It has the shape of self-certainty, or it has its existence. It is in its existence in the form of self-knowledge. Now, Hegel doesn't say it quite like that. He says that it is in its existence, its Dasein, right? Truth is in its own existence. And then he says, das heißt, that means that, now here's closer to the German. It is for knowing spirit, wissende Geist, in the form of knowing itself, right? So in its existence, that is, for knowing spirit in the form of knowing itself. These are also things that are not identical, but are the same, meaning, or we can unpack it, you could say, right? So it's not just in its existence in the form of self-knowledge. It's a little bit more complex here. So we're getting a very interesting discussion of truth as it pertains to absolute knowing. And then he goes on and he says, truth is the content, which in religion is still not identical. It's ungleich, right, with its certainty. But this identity is now a fact. The word fact is not in there in the German at all, right? There's nothing that actually corresponds to that. I'm not sure why Miller wants to say that, unless we understand fact in the older sense, not of just being something that we observe, but something that is produced, a factum, right? Something that was done, in that the content has received the shape of the self. So now we've got shape of spirit, shape of consciousness, shape of self-certainty, and shape of self, right? And he'll talk about the shape of the self and the essence, the Wesen of the self. And what is this? He goes on, that which is the very essence, the notion, the essence of the self, the notion, has become two things. The element of existence, Dasein, which we've seen talked about here, right? So something that actually exists. But also the form of objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit, right? Now, not objectivity in the sense of that sometimes English speakers say, oh, something is objective as opposed to subjective. It's the damn self we're talking about here. Of course it's subjective, right? It's a subject. So don't think of objectivity in that sense. But objectivity is something that is out there that we can encounter. Ourselves are in part outside of ourselves, aren't they? And what does this exist for? Well, it says the notion has become the element of existence, or has become the form of objectivity for consciousness. And then he says spirit manifesting or appearing in consciousness in this element, the element being existence, right? Or what is the same thing, produced in it by consciousness. This is science. This is Wissenschaft. This is what we've been seeking for the entire time. Now, of course, we've been seeking other things too, recognition, Anerkennen, the other self-consciousness. But we've also been looking for, I want to figure out what the hell's going on here and where I fit in and how I relate to the rest of the stuff that I can know, will about, think about, desire, right? And that's what science is getting us to. So we now have an explicit sketch of what the last shape of consciousness, the last shape of spirit, the last shape of the self is. Absolute knowing, the section that we are now deep within and figuring out what does absolute knowing actually mean. Well, one answer is it is science in the full sense.